Let me tell you something about David Grove and why he was so influential in the development of our approach to coaching, therapy, and just about everything else we do. James and I first saw David Grove in 1993. He was giving a talk in London and demonstrating his approach with two clients. Amazingly, he was working with both of them at the same time, going from one to the other and asking these strange questions he called clean language. We'd never seen anything like it, but somehow I knew something profound, almost sacred, was happening for these two clients. I was hooked and compelled to find out more.
So in those days, David used to visit England every 6 months to run therapeutic retreats. I mean, he didn't teach his work in a structured way. He just demonstrated what he did and then he'd debrief it afterwards. So for the next 4 years, we attended every event David did in England. We modeled what he was doing, we used it with our clients, and we created our own model of what made this work so effective. And we called our approach Symbolic Modelling and described it in metaphors in mind. We didn't stop modelling David after we'd written the book because he was a serial innovator. Most people would be content to come up with 1 or 2 new ways of doing therapy, but not David. No, he came up with dozens, and we continued to learn from him right up until his unexpected death in 2008.
It's now 40 years since David first came up with the idea of clean language. He started by applying it as a method for helping people suffering from traumatic childhood memories and with military veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. He noticed that when his clients were trying to describe their experience, they would often stop just before the worst moments and say, "It was like," and then they would give a metaphor. Rather than asking them to recount the details of the trauma, which was a common method at the time, David got curious and began asking questions about the metaphors they were using rather than the traumatic event itself, and he got amazing results.
His genius was to realize that metaphors do not like being asked ordinary questions, and he spent years finding the few questions that would give life to people's personal metaphors. Sometimes he even referred to himself as a midwife, and that's how clean language was born. And David discovered that by staying clean and not contaminating his client's experience with his own interpretations and suggestions, their metaphors changed organically and healed the suffering in a way that was unique to each and every person.
And what would you like to have happen is the clean language question we usually start a coaching or therapy session with. The translated reply, "I would like the inflammation of my gums to stop," came from a member of a group of Ukrainian psychologists we've been supporting since the Russian invasion. Since we're not doctors or dentists, we could not provide medical advice, but we could work with the client's relationship with her symptoms. It turned out that she considered the inflammation a reaction to her situation. Our client had been evacuated to live in the west of Ukraine with the mother and son of a soldier on the front line. 2 days before our session, the mother had been notified that her husband had been killed in war, and she asked help to tell her son. Our client said she wanted to tear apart with my teeth all these abusers who kill our people, and was deeply emotional, understandably. She said, I don't know how to find the words to help the mother tell her son his father had died.
Of course, we could have suggested any number of supportive words, but that's not how we work. Our process is strongly predicated on the NLP presupposition that people already have all the resources they need to act effectively. The client statement implies that the words are not the problem. The problem is that the client doesn't know how to find them, which is a metaphor. It might seem strange, but we take clients' metaphors, like this one, literally.
As the session progressed, the client accessed a state she described as a warm and trembling love that wants to support this mother and child. Through a series of clean language questions, this resource developed into a metaphor of two oval spots located in her solar plexus. Spontaneously, the spots morphed into two connected galaxies.
So I asked, and when it's like those two galaxies are connected, there in your solar plexus, and that's a warmth and a trembling of a love that wants to support, there, what happens to words in a memory?
After a pause, she answered that the words she needed to find can be put together like planets in a galaxy that go by one in a spiral.
And so when those words are put together like planets in a galaxy, then what happens?
The client said, and then a kind of connection or link appears between the father who has died and this boy, and the words, they help the child to experience and realize this connection.
The client didn't need to find the words there and then. Instead, she had access to a resource metaphor, which meant the appropriate words would come when she needed them. And who could have guessed that a spiral galaxy would be just the support she needed to do that? At the end of the session, we inquired, and what happens in your gums?
She said, first of all, I'm starting to breathe, and my gums hold my teeth tightly. And right now, I don't feel any negative feelings or sensations.
Clean language questions allow clients' untarnished experience to be revealed, first to them and then to you. The art is to recognize that the structure of the metaphor corresponds to the structure of what it represents. As clean language questions are asked and the metaphor landscape is developed, psychoactivity occurs. The metaphor spontaneously changes, and these changes are reflected isomorphically in the client's experience and behavior. There are 4 components in symbolic modelling: clean language, metaphor, modelling, and outcome orientation. Taken together, these enable a facilitator to model symbolically and to facilitate clients cleanly. On any introduction to clean language, you're going to be given 8 or 12 of the basic clean language questions. 30 years after we first saw David Grove, these exact same questions still form the core of all that we do. So how is it that we and others are able to facilitate clients to experience such transformative changes with so few questions? How can something so apparently restrictive facilitate clients to be so creative? How does less become more.
Working cleanly involves more than just asking clean language questions. For a start, we call our approach symbolic modeling because first and foremost, it's a modeling methodology. In our approach, change is not a step in a technique. It's not even the aim of the process. In symbolic modeling, change happens spontaneously as an organic byproduct of facilitating the client to self-model the structure and logic of their own unique symbolic and metaphoric world. Symbolic modeling doesn't simply recapitulate what David Grove was doing. We included the latest developments in cognitive linguistics, self-organizing systems theory, and evolutionary dynamics to give our approach a solid theoretical underpinning and a wide remit.
Early in his career, David Grove discovered that people's inner worlds, their mind-body maps, are fundamentally metaphoric in nature and have their own coherent logic. This was revolutionary in the early 1980s, and it still is today. It's rarely appreciated that people commonly use 6 metaphors a minute, even in everyday conversations. Mostly these metaphors are not recognized as such, and those that are easily recognized are often highly idiosyncratic. For example, on TV recently, I saw the athlete Tahani Seagrave describe the effects of a concussion, and she said, "It was like I was drowning. My whole body was just underwater and I just had enough air to breathe." And she did this. She was enacting her metaphor. David discovered that personal metaphors do not respond well to leading questions. Those are the questions that attempt to reframe or change the client's experience or otherwise suggest an answer. So whether intentional or not, leading questions introduce the coach or the therapist's beliefs, their values, their presuppositions. However, something special happens if you only ask clean language questions of the client's metaphors.
And finally, the fourth component of symbolic modeling is a particular kind of outcome orientation that James and I brought to the field after modeling expert therapists who worked bottom up, such as David Grove, Steve DeShazer, Robert Dilt, Steve Andreas, and ourselves. We see outcome orientation as a continual process that uses the client's desires, wants, would likes, and needs as a dynamic reference point, which act as beacons or signposts for a process that doesn't know where it is going to end up. We also borrowed from the work of Robert Fritz and Paul Václavic to create our problem remedy outcome model, which is now being used not only in change work, but also to keep business meetings on track, in education, and in many other contexts.
We think having a working knowledge of any of these components, clean language, metaphor, modeling, or outcome orientation, will enhance whatever type of coaching or therapy you do.
David Grove used to say all questions are up to something. The distinction between leading and clean questions is they are up to different things. The vast majority of questions people ask, whether in everyday conversation or in a professional setting, are leading. A new book, Clean Language Interviewing, goes into great detail about the difference between the two types of question. David Grove spent 25 years looking for clean, non-leading questions. In all that time, he found less than a dozen that are universally clean. That is, they can be asked in almost any context, including therapy and coaching.
So what makes a clean language question clean? And why are there so few of them? Despite what followers of Carl Rogers might think, there's no such thing as a non-directive question. All questions are directive, even clean language questions, in that every question invites the client to consider one thing rather than another. Clean language questions operate at a process level. They do not introduce any content. They only incorporate the information that's already been supplied by the client using their exact words. All the other words in the question are process words that are short, simple, and relate to fundamental ideas about space, time, and matter.
The reason there are so few questions that meet this criteria is because there is a surprisingly small number of universal concepts that exist in every language studied so far. These universal concepts are called semantic primes, and they form the basis of the classic clean language questions, such as, and is there anything else about? And what kind of is that? And where is? But there's more to a clean language question than the words. There's also the purpose or intention of a clean question and the way it is asked.
Clean language questions are designed to send a client on a quest for self-knowledge. We call this the client self-modelling. Even when a facilitator feels they need to know the answer to a question, clean language questions are designed so that the client discovers the information for themselves first, and only then, if they wish, shares it with the facilitator. As David Grove used to say, clean language is deeply agreeable to the client's heart and soul.
A list of the commonly asked clean questions, including translations in over 20 languages, are freely available on our website, cleanlanguage.com.
Ordinary conversation is littered with metaphors, most of which are out of awareness. In fact, it's hard to put together a sentence which does not contain a hidden metaphor. In the 1980s, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's analysis of common metaphors created the foundation for the cognitive linguistic revolution. They said, the essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. At the same time that Lakoff and Johnson were discovering the general structure to metaphor, David Grove was recognizing the significance of personal metaphors in therapy. He developed clean language to respect and value the role an individual's metaphors and symbols play in organizing their experience. And more than that, a metaphor provides a window into the structure and framing of another person's inner world. This is what David Grove called their metaphor landscape.
Recognizing both verbal and nonverbal metaphors is vital to symbolic modeling, and to get good at it takes practice. We learn to sensitize our metaphor detectors to both the subtle and implicit metaphors embedded in everyday language by practicing offline. Here are a few ways we did that. One way to know if an expression is metaphorical is to ask yourself, is the speaker describing something that actually exists in the physical or behavioral world, or is it like something? So if they say, there is a gold nugget in my heart, you can be sure there is not a piece of gold in there, but it seems like there is to the client.
Also, we used to scan newspaper articles. The financial pages are full of metaphors. I mean, markets crash, economies grow, and we have inflation. We read client transcripts and we listened to the radio. Today it would be podcasts. And we picked out the most obvious metaphors. Then we'd start all over again, go through them for the more subtle metaphors. And then we'd ask ourselves, how did we know those were the metaphors? For example, a client said, so what I'm hoping for is a stopgap that when I'm feeling like a rebellious teenager, I have the presence of mind to breathe, to be calm, and to tune in. Well, clearly, rebellious teenager is a metaphor, but did you also notice stopgap, presence of mind, and tune in?
We all use embodiment to sensitize our system to metaphor. We'd practice doing or physically modeling the metaphor using micromuscular movements. So if someone says, I run away from fear, we'd use our body to make micromuscular movements that replicate running away. Or we would draw a simple schema that represented the spatial and temporal relationships implicit in the metaphor.
So the aim of practicing offline is for your system to develop automatic signals for when a metaphor is spoken in real time. When you get this signal, then you have a choice to pay more attention to the metaphor than you might have done. In the early days of modelling David Grove, Penny and I attended every workshop he did when he was in the UK. They were usually residential, so we had a lot of access to him. The more we showed up, the more he realised just how serious we were about getting good at using his method. One day, David overheard Penny practicing asking clean language questions with another participant. That evening, he asked her if she would like to do some practice with him. Now, who's going to say no to that?
David and I stood up about 10 feet, 3 meters apart, facing each other. Then he said, go on, ask me a question. So I asked him, and what would you like to have happen? He said, where do you think that question landed? Well, probably over there, I said, waving my hand in his general direction. No, he said, that question fell somewhere in the space between us. It never reached me. Ask it again, only this time with oomph. And he added, if you don't got oomph, you don't got it. So I had another go. We did this over and over until I learned to ask my questions with my whole torso, not just from the top part of my chest and throat. David also said once I could deliver a question with oomph. I needed to pay attention to where my question landed in the client's perceptual space. To do this, I needed to know where the client perceived their symbols to be in their space, and to deliver my question to that particular space. Again, practice was needed, and when I finally got it, it was like I was an archer that could fire an arrow and hit the bullseye. This taught me that my attention needed to be over there in the client's metaphor landscape. Learning to deliver questions like this transformed the effectiveness of every future clean language question I ever asked.
So, instead of thinking, what question should I ask next? We first wonder, What and where in the metaphor landscape would it be useful for the client to attend to? Once we know that, choosing the appropriate clean language question is easy.